J.D. Vance just eviscerated Adam Schiff's 7-year media facade, name by shattered name. Schiff just called this hearing a revenge tour, directly to the face of a vice president who spent the weekend memorizing the victims Schiff annihilated on television, then callously forgot. Not politicians, not intelligence operatives, not the elite names you've heard on cable news for 7 years. The other names, the forgotten ones. The Naval Academy graduate who was never charged with a crime, but remains permanently unemployable. The 3-star general forced to sell his house. The 8-year-old kid who served 12 days in lockup for misstating a single date. And a woman in Ohio, a data entry worker making $35,000 a year, who drained her entire savings on a lawyer because Adam Schiff peddled fictions on CNN. Schiff told those fables for free. Everyone else paid the tab. Smash that like button because you are about to watch J.D. Vance read the human cost of 7 years of lies, name by name, dollar by dollar, to the man who never bothered to count them. June 4, 2025. Room 226, Dirksen Senate Office Building. The Senate Judiciary Committee convened a hearing on accountability for misconduct in congressional intelligence oversight, a title designed to sound procedural, but Washington knew exactly what it meant. Adam Schiff was going to be grilled, under oath, about the 7 years he spent telling America the President of the United States was a compromised foreign asset. Senator Adam Schiff, Democrat of California, newly elected to the Senate in 2024, freshly transitioned from the House, where he reigned for 24 years, still wearing the arrogance of a man who survived 2 impeachment trials, a House censure, and 423 cable news appearances without ever once admitting he'd been wrong. He sat at the witness table with the posture of a man convinced he was the smartest person in the room. He was, in many cases, correct. Adam Schiff was brilliant. That was never the question. The question was what he weaponized that brilliance for. Vice President J.D. Vance presided from the chair. A single manila folder sat on his desk. No colored tabs, no classified stamps, no theatrical props. Inside the folder were 5 sheets of paper. Each sheet bore a single name at the top. Schiff launched his opening statement before the chairman even finished introductions. A classic Schiff signature. The calculated interruption. The tone that declared, "I will dictate the terms of this conversation because I have dictated conversations in this building for 24 years. Mr. Vice President, let me be blunt." Schiff's voice was the ultimate instrument, the one that had echoed across CNN studios, MSNBC panels, and House chamber floors, carrying the measured cadence of a former federal prosecutor who never truly left the courtroom. This hearing is not about accountability. This is a revenge tour. He eyed Vance not dismissively, but clinically. Schiff was far too shrewd to underestimate an opponent he hadn't fully measured. "Your president ordered the Attorney General to investigate me. Your president posted on social media, for the entire world to see, that Pam Bondi should target Adam Schiff. And when the career prosecutor in Maryland concluded there wasn't enough evidence to charge me, they relentlessly kept pushing. This hearing is a circus, Mr. Vice President. You are the ringmaster, and the audience is an administration that has warped the Department of Justice into a political weapon." He paused. The prosecutor's pause. The silence that signals, "I've fired my shot, now let it bleed." You want to discuss misconduct in intelligence oversight? Let's discuss a vice president serving an administration that purged inspectors general, gutted intelligence agencies, and appointed a director of national intelligence whose sole qualification was blind fealty to one man. He glared at the committee. "You don't get to lecture me about oversight. You serve the man I tried to hold accountable, twice, and I damn gladly do it again," the gallery murmured. Schiff's delivery was impeccable. It always was. 24 years of relentless practice had honed his speaking voice into a mechanism as precise as a Swiss watch, and exactly as cold as a Swiss bank. You could marvel at the machinery while deeply distrusting its output. On the presiding officer's dais, Vance merely absorbed it. He didn't flinch at revenge tour, didn't react to ringmaster, didn't bat an eye at the insinuation he was a puppet. He'd endured far worse from his own mother on her darkest nights, and his mother's darkest nights eclipsed anything Adam Schiff could conjure in a sterile hearing room. When Schiff concluded, Vance opened his folder, glanced at the first page, and locked eyes with Schiff. "Senator Schiff," he began, his voice carrying that flat Midwestern timbre that never spiked, because it never needed to. "Thank you for the opening statement. I've honestly heard better. My grandmother used to argue with the television, and she was far more persuasive, but I appreciate the effort." A ripple of nervous laughter. Vance didn't smile. "I am not going to discuss Russia today. Director Gabbard already exposed your files on live television. The nation saw exactly what was inside them. I am not going to discuss FISA warrants. Attorney General Bondi owns that investigation, and I will let it play out. And I am not going to discuss your mortgage, because that is strictly between you and the U.S. Attorney in Maryland." He looked down at the folder. "I want to talk about people, specific people, individuals whose names you exploited, whose lives you derailed, whose careers you obliterated not with hard evidence, but with prime-time television appearances. People who paid the brutal price for your narratives, people you have never apologized to, people you have likely forgotten." He turned to the first page. "I haven't forgotten them. Let me reintroduce you. Carter Page," Vance stated. Just the name. Letting it sink into the hearing room like an anvil dropped into a glass pond. United States Naval Academy. Class of 1993. Served as a Marine intelligence officer, later worked for Merrill Lynch in Moscow, legally, transparently, with the full knowledge and occasional coordination of U.S. intelligence agencies. In 2016, he briefly advised the Trump campaign on energy policy. Briefly, he attended a handful of meetings. He drafted a couple of memos. He was not a senior operative. He was not in the inner circle. He was a man with regional expertise who volunteered a fraction of his time. Vance locked eyes with Schiff. "And you morphed him into the most infamous accused foreign spy in America." Schiff shifted in his leather chair. Not dramatically, just the microscopic recalibration of a man sensing the tectonic plates moving beneath him. "You championed the FISA warrant applications used to wiretap Carter Page. You paraded on television claiming the warrants were lawful, critical, and anchored by credible evidence. You declared this publicly, repeatedly, wielding the immense authority of the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee." Vance flipped a page. Inspector General Horowitz scrutinized those exact warrant applications and unearthed 17 catastrophic errors and omissions. 17. Not trivial clerical typos, catastrophic errors. An FBI lawyer, Kevin Kleinsmith, pleaded guilty to doctoring evidence in the warrant application. He forged an email to explicitly state Carter Page was not a source for another government agency, when in verifiable fact, he was a vital source. Kleinsmith went to federal lockup for that. He fabricated evidence to wiretap an American citizen, and you blindly defended the corrupt machinery that produced it. He set the paper down. Carter Page was never charged with a single infraction. Not one. No indictment, no arrest, no trial, no conviction. Zero. The man you branded a foreign agent across 423 television appearances, I know the exact metric because someone tallied it, and the tally is 423 was never charged with a damn thing. Schiff lunged toward his microphone. The FISA process was formally validated by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is the very court that swallowed the applications infected with 17 errors and forged evidence. Vance interjected. His tone didn't escalate, didn't fracture. It simply flowed forward like a river eroding a stone. "I've digested the Inspector General's report, Senator. All 476 pages. Have you?" Schiff's jaw hung suspended for a half-second, that agonizing half-second between formulating a counterattack and realizing the ammunition is blank. He shut his mouth. "Carter Page is a Naval Academy alumni who wore this country's uniform," Vance pressed on. "Today, he is functionally unemployable. His name is toxic. Not toxic in the fleeting political sense, but in the literal, corporate HR sense. He applied for strategic roles at 3 energy consulting firms after the Mueller report entirely exonerated him. All 3 instantly rejected him. Not because he lacked qualifications, Naval Academy, Merrill Lynch, deep energy sector fluency, but solely because of his Google search results. Google Carter Page, and the top 40 hits scream Russia. They scream a phantom conspiracy he was never part of, never indicted for, never convicted of. An HR director at one of those firms confessed to him off the record, Because nobody dares say this on the record, we cannot hire you. Your name is a walking liability. Our clients would see it and instantly panic about Russia. Vance let the silence stretch, an HR director, a liability. Not because of any action Carter Page took, but entirely because of the words Adam Schiff broadcasted. He incinerated years and hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees to salvage a reputation that you smeared on television for absolutely free. Hundreds of thousands for a civilian in the private sector, a man without a cushy government pension, a man without a bloated political war chest. He drained his own bank accounts to pay his own lawyers to definitively prove that the venom you spewed about him on CNN was completely hollow. And the lawyers proved it. Mueller proved it. Horowitz proved it. Durham proved it. Every single entity proved it. Yet Carter Page remains untouchable. Vance stared right through Schiff. You weaponized his name when it fueled your narrative. When the narrative collapsed, you never uttered his name again. You didn't pivot back to CNN and confess, I was dead wrong about Carter Page. You issued zero corrections. You offered zero public statements conceding that the veteran you branded a foreign spy for 3 agonizing years was profoundly innocent. You just discarded him. Exactly like a prop you finished exploiting, like a magician shoving a dove back into a cramped box after the applause fades. Except the dove is a human being, and the box is an obliterated career. He turned the page. Let me introduce you to another man you discarded. Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, United States Army, 33 years of decorated service, 5 grueling combat deployments, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency under President Obama. Vance recited the credentials with slow, deliberate gravity, not for dramatic flair, but for absolute weight. Every single word represented a year of sacrifice. Every year represented a deployment, a high-stakes briefing, a life-or-death call made at 3:00 a.m. In a bunker where a miscalculation meant zipping up body bags. You branded him compromised. You labeled him a foreign asset on national television, relentlessly, long before the facts were gathered, long before the probe concluded, while the man still legally retained the presumption of innocence, a core principle that you, a former federal prosecutor, swore an oath to blindly uphold. Vance's volume remained steady, but his jaw visibly locked. The signature Vance Tell, the hinge flex that signaled the data, had transmuted into something deeply personal. I deployed with the Marines, Senator. Every single Marine reveres General Flynn's name. He commanded the Defense Intelligence Agency. He was no polished politician. He was a ruthless warfighter who transitioned into intelligence because he understood, intimately, that superior intelligence keeps trigger pullers alive on the battlefield. To every Marine, every soldier, every sailor who bled while Flynn ran the DIA. That man is an unbreakable brother in arms. He narrowed his eyes at Schiff, and you butchered his reputation on television for cheap ratings. Schiff thrust himself forward. General Flynn formally pleaded guilty to lying to, and subsequently withdrew that coerced plea. Vance cut in. After the FBI's own raw notes, handwritten notes, Senator, the exact kind you cannot doctor retroactively, proved that the very agents interrogating him did not believe he was lying. The agent's literal scribbles doesn't seem like he's lying. They're precise words. In their own ink. Schiff scrambled for a foothold. The judicial process. The judicial process culminated in a full pardon and a dismissed case. Those are the sterile legal realities. But the bleeding human realities unfolded much sooner. The human reality is that Michael Flynn, a 3-star general carrying 33 years of honorable service, was forced to sell his house. Vance paused. Not a rhetorical metaphor. He physically sold his family home in Virginia just to cover suffocating legal fees. Fees he racked up solely because you convinced America he was a covert agent before the actual evidence existed. He let the bleak imagery steep, a decorated general signing over the deed at a bleak closing table, surrendering the keys to the sanctuary where his children grew up, all because a California congressman needed a primetime villain. And it wasn't merely the brick and mortar, it was the entire life tethered to that house. The retirement nest egg he bled 33 years to secure, evaporated by legal bills? The premium speaking engagements retired generals rely on? Instantly canceled, because no respectable university, no elite think tank, and no Fortune 500 board would dare associate with a man Adam Schiff had aggressively labeled a foreign operative on national broadcasts. The friendships? You'd be horrified to learn how fast your inner circle vanishes when CNN plasters your face next to the word compromised every single evening for 2 unrelenting years. General Flynn didn't just forfeit a mortgage, he forfeited his life, the exact life he had painstakingly earned across 3 decades of sacrifice. Vance let it hang. And while he was bleeding out that life, you were busy executing a different maneuver. You were fabricating a transcript. He glared at Schiff. September 2019. The Trump-Zelensky phone call. You recited a doctored version of that conversation before the Intelligence Committee, flanked by rolling cameras, under the solemn seal of the committee you chaired. It was undeniably not the authentic transcript. You injected words. You warped the context. You fully invented dialogue out of thin air. And when you were caught, when the unredacted transcript dropped and the world realized your performance was pure fiction, you casually dismissed it as a parody. Vance slowly shook his head. A parody. The sitting chairman of the House Intelligence Committee hallucinates official testimony and brands it a parody. While Michael Flynn was liquidating his family home to finance your previous fiction, you were already scripting the sequel. General Flynn sold his house. You and we will inevitably arrive at this later, are currently facing a federal probe for falsifying the documents on yours. Vance flipped the page. But we will circle back to that. Next name. George Papadopoulos. Vance pronounced the name with a calibrated gentleness, the specific tone reserved for victims who are simply too young to comprehend the meat grinder they've been thrown into. 28 years old back in 2016. A kid. Not a hardened spymaster, not an elite operative. A kid out of Chicago who studied international relations at DePaul and the University of London. A kid who desperately wanted to shape foreign policy the exact same way other kids dream of walking on the moon, fueled by a naive, genuine conviction that the work actually matters. He addressed the broader committee. 28. Burn that number into your minds. Because 28 is the fleeting age where you still blindly trust that grinding hard and playing by the rules will elevate you to your dreams. 28 is the twilight before you discover that the machine occasionally ignores the rules. Sometimes, the machine just requires a scalp, and your scalp happens to be the closest one. Vance pivoted back to Schiff. Papadopoulos secured a baseline advisory slot on the Trump campaign's foreign policy bench. Baseline. He was a minor face in a crowded room. He sat in on a few briefings. He engaged in a few chats. The FBI, as Special Counsel Durham, later painstakingly exposed, dispatched undercover informants to ambush him. Stephen Halper, a female operative cloaked under the alias Azra Turk, and others. They aggressively initiated the contact. They deliberately dangled bait regarding Russia. They artificially engineered the exact nefarious connections they were supposedly authorized to investigate. Durham branded these investigative leaps as seriously flawed, and explicitly condemned the FBI for launching a full-blown dragnet on the absolute thinnest of pretexts. Vance stopped. Let me repeat that for the record. The FBI deployed assets to target Papadopoulos, not the reverse. They cornered him. They injected Russia into the dialogue. And when he engaged simply because he was 28, hungry for relevance, and entirely oblivious that he was being played, the FBI weaponized his responses to justify their dragnet. That is not intelligence gathering. Back in Middletown, we call that a dirty setup. Vance shook his head with that agonizingly slow rhythm, the rhythm of a man looking at math that is fundamentally corrupt. He pleaded guilty to delivering a single false statement to the FBI regarding the specific timing of a meeting. The timing, not the meeting itself. He freely admitted the meeting took place, he just scrambled the calendar date. He claimed it occurred prior to joining the campaign when it actually transpired shortly after. And for that trivial calendar glitch, he was caged in federal lockup for 12 days. He locked onto Schiff. You exploited his name on television as the smoking gun for a massive web of Russian contacts. Your exact, repeated phrasing, web of Russian contacts. A 8-year-old kid who fumbled a calendar date during an ambush interview was magically transformed, via your megaphone, into the linchpin of a global espionage conspiracy. He possessed no elite legal defense fund. He lacked your untouchable connections. He didn't have the Clinton Foundation or the California Democratic machine stroking massive checks to white-shoe defense attorneys. He had his meager savings account, his terrified parents, and a shattered dream of public service. Vance dropped his voice. You morphed that pure dream into a bleak mugshot. And you never lost a single microsecond of sleep over it. Schiff nervously cleared his throat. The Durham investigation was fiercely criticized by the exact individuals it investigated. Vance parried instantly. Yes, criminals routinely criticize the detectives who catch them. That is hardly a revelation. Schiff's jaw visibly clamped, not the disciplined Vance clamp. It was the rigid, defensive clamp of a man accustomed to dominating the narrative, who was rapidly realizing, casualty by casualty, that this specific narrative was engineered to be impenetrable. Vance slid the third page aside, hoisted the fourth, and stared at it for a prolonged moment. Longer than he had lingered on any previous sheet. When he finally broke the silence, his pitch had shifted, not louder, not softer, just meticulously slower. The deliberate tempo of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. Let me introduce you to someone you've absolutely never heard of. I won't use her real name today. She explicitly begged me not to. She is still profoundly terrified. The hearing room flatlined. Not the tense quiet of anticipation, but the suffocating quiet of a crowd realizing the incoming payload was entirely different from the previous strikes. Carter Page was an established public figure. Flynn was a renowned general. Papadopoulos was a media fixture. The next target was a ghost, someone who had never touched the headlines and prayed she never would. We'll call her Jennifer. She's 31 now, was 31 back in 2018. She handled low-level data entry for a presidential campaign out in Ohio, not a high-stakes senior role, not a glamorous policy gig. Data entry. She mindlessly typed names into endless spreadsheets. She batched email lists. She pulled down $35,000 a year. In Ohio, that's barely enough to lease a basic two-bedroom apartment and feed a single child, provided you never dine out and exclusively buy generic brands. Vance bypassed Schiff entirely, aiming his gaze directly at the surrounding senators. Because Jennifer's tragedy wasn't meant for Schiff, Schiff lacked the baseline empathy to process it. Jennifer's tragedy was meant for the senators employing staffers exactly like Jennifer, for the invisible staffers watching who were Jennifer. In 2018, she was blindsided by a federal subpoena from the special counsel's office, not because she committed a crime, but because one single email she had mechanically processed, one email buried in a stack of thousands, happened to contain a name that ended up on a list, that ended up in a dossier, that ended up being broadcast on Senator Schiff's television soap opera. He let the chain of events hang in the air. One rogue email, clicked by a woman surviving on $35,000 a year. She didn't author it. She didn't read it. She just processed it. Data entry. And for that clerical reflex, she was handed a federal subpoena. The room was devoid of oxygen. A federal subpoena instantly mandates a lawyer. Washington defense attorneys capable of navigating federal subpoenas bill out between $400 and $800 an hour. Jennifer's total gross income was $35,000 a year. Do the brutal math. He refused to do it for them. He let the silent arithmetic crush every soul in the room. Let the staggering disproportion of $400 an hour versus $35,000 a year sink to the bone. She hemorrhaged $22,000 on legal fees, her entire life savings, every single dollar she had scraped together for absolute emergencies, the transmission failing, the winter furnace dying, the mundane disasters that inevitably strike people surviving on $35,000 a year without a financial safety net, $22,000. Vaporized, just to respond to a blind subpoena that ultimately yielded absolutely nothing. Vance's voice descended further, not to a theatrical whisper, but to the hollow frequency of a man shouldering authentic grief rather than performing it. Her name was never printed in the Mueller report. She was never summoned to the witness stand. She was never accused of a single violation. The subpoena was stamped. The blood-sucking lawyers were paid. And the massive investigation simply rolled on. It rolled forward to fresh names, fresh emails, fresh spreadsheets. The machine completely forgot about Jennifer, the exact same way a Category 5 hurricane forgets about the trailer parks it flattens. He stared down at the paper. Her son, 6 years old at the time, found her sobbing uncontrollably at their small kitchen table. He innocently asked why Mommy was crying so hard. She just choked out, "Work stuff." Because what on earth do you tell a terrified 6-year-old? Do you tell him mommy is crying because a powerful congressman in California went on TV and spun fairy tales? And those fairy tales spawned a federal witch hunt? And that witch hunt mailed a terrifying piece of paper to our front door? And that single piece of paper just stole every last dime we ever saved? You don't burden a 6-year-old with that horror. You just say work stuff, you dry your eyes, and you go cook dinner. Vance pivoted back to Schiff. Schiff remained paralyzed, did not interrupt, did not lean forward, did not utter a syllable, because Robert S. Rules of Order contained no procedural objection to a mother weeping at a kitchen table. The federal code offered no legal framework for a child asking why they were broke. There was no FISA application to hide behind, no Durham report to deflect, no historical impeachment precedent to invoke. There was only a broken mother, a confused boy, and $22,000 permanently gone. And the architect of the storm that stole it was sitting 6 feet away, wrapped in a pristine $3,000 suit, having absolutely nothing to say. This was the fracture point. Schiff's legendary courtroom voice, the elite instrument he had fine-tuned over 24 years, the weapon that could slice any fact, deflect any accusation, and neuter any inquiry, possessed no frequency for a 6-year-old asking why mommy was crying. The voice engineered to dominate intelligence hearings, survive impeachment trials, and command primetime panels was utterly impotent against Jennifer. Because Jennifer wasn't a complex political puzzle. Jennifer was a raw human casualty, and Schiff's instrument was incapable of playing human notes. Vance quietly set the 4th page down. He picked up the 5th, and for the very first time, he looked at the paper with an emotion devoid of sorrow, rage, or clinical precision. He looked at it with the exact expression his grandmother would have classified as disappointed, the lethal expression that cuts deeper than rage, because rage implies the expectation of a fight. Disappointment means you expected a baseline of decency and were utterly denied. The 5th name on this list is yours, Senator. Schiff blinked hard, his first involuntary twitch in 10 minutes. I want to juxtapose your financial reality directly against theirs, not as a petty attack, as a mirror. Because the sheer contrast tells this story far more brutally than I ever could. He scanned the page. But first, since we are establishing the caliber of company you keep, let's discuss Ed Buck, a prominent Democratic megadonor. He funneled $2,700 into your campaign. You happily pocketed that cash through 2 horrific fatalities, Senator. 2 desperate men suffered fatal substance overdoses right inside Ed Buck's apartment. Jemel Moore in 2017 and Timothy Dean in 2019. Buck was ultimately convicted on 9 severe felony counts and locked in federal custody for 30 years. Yet you hoarded his political donation through both of those tragedies. You only surrendered the dirty money long after Buck was sitting in handcuffs. Vance let the ugliness marinate. 2 human beings died. You kept the cash. A convicted felon bankrolled you, and you gripped his $2,700 until holding it morphed into a political liability. That isn't a careless oversight. That is a ruthless calculation. He transitioned to the stark financial ledger. Now, Carter Page liquidated his real estate to pay defense attorneys for a phantom crime he was never charged with. You, Senator Schiff, are currently the target of an active criminal probe by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland for suspected mortgage fraud, for allegedly doctoring bank documents and property records to illegally secure highly favorable loan terms on your massive estate in Potomac. An estate you brazenly claimed as your primary residence, while simultaneously claiming a condominium in Burbank, California, as your primary residence. The Federal Housing Finance Agency triggered a direct criminal referral to the DOJ, explicitly flagging potential violations of wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, and submitting false statements to financial institutions. He let the hypocrisy burn. One patriot sold his home to survive your slander. You are facing federal investigators for allegedly defrauding yours. Vance turned to the next glaring contrast. General Flynn was stripped of his military retirement. He sold the sanctuary where he raised his kids just to pay legal invoices generated because you convinced the nation he was a Russian asset. You, Senator, possess a sprawling legal defense fund, flushed with $1.2 million as of the latest FEC filing, propped up by 400 elite donors, massive political action committees, and an Indian tribe. $1.2 $2 million specifically stockpiled to pay your lawyers." He stared with pure disgust at Schiff. General Flynn didn't have a corrupt legal defense fund. He had an honest pension he bled 33 years to secure, and a mortgage he finally paid off. He lost both. You possess $1.2 million in slush money, gifted by elites who desperately owe you political favors. I suppose that is the glaring difference between a decorated combat general and a slippery politician. He turned to the final, sickening contrast. Jennifer vaporized $22,000. Her absolute entire life savings. She didn't have super PACs. She didn't have mega donors. She didn't have shady political committees cutting her blank checks. She had a basic savings account, a checking account, and a hungry 6-year-old. $22,000. Erased. Vance snapped the folder shut, shoved it aside, clasped his hands together. You spun intoxicating stories for 7 unbroken years, Senator. 423 television appearances. And those televised fictions cost Carter Page his entire career. They cost General Flynn his family home. They cost George Papadopoulos 12 days of his freedom and his entire bright future. They cost Jennifer $22,000 and her little boy's basic sense of security. And what exactly did they cost you? He paused. Absolutely nothing. The word hung in the sterile air like a guillotine blade. Until this exact second, they cost you zero. You strutted onto television. You spun your elaborate tales. You commuted home to your Potomac estate, the very estate you allegedly defrauded a bank to acquire. You easily harvested $1.2 million for your elite defense fund. You secured a promotion to the United States Senate. You sit in this prestigious building as an untouchable colleague. Meanwhile, the everyday people whose lives you decimated went home to hollow kitchen tables, sold off their houses, drowned in legal bills, and faced crying 6-year-olds asking questions no child should ever have to ask. He turned his glare to the committee. 3 short weeks ago, Senator Schiff went on Meet the Press and loudly declared he is vehemently opposed to spending taxpayer money on DOJ investigations. 3 weeks ago, Vance shook his head. That slow, mournful pivot of the neck. The exact same man who spent 7 uninterrupted years screeching for taxpayer-funded investigations of a sitting president is suddenly, magically opposed to taxpayer-funded investigations. The single, solitary variable that shifted is who is caught in the crosshairs. Vance slowly rose from his chair, the exact way he always stood at the end, deliberately. The way a man stands when the physical act carries profound weight. It wasn't a cheap power play. It was the final nail. Senator Schiff, I have one concluding question. It is not about Russia, not about the FISA courts, not about your suspected mortgage fraud, not about your bloated legal defense fund. Just one basic, human question. He locked eyes with Schiff, dead on. The physical void between the presiding officer's elevated dais and the witness table spanned exactly 12 feet. In that moment, those 12 feet constituted the vastest gulf on earth. Have you ever once apologized to Carter Page? Silence. 1 agonizing second. 2. Have you ever once called Michael Flynn the decorated general who surrendered his home because of your primetime theatrics and said, I am deeply sorry I branded you a foreign spy before the facts were known? 3 seconds. 4. Have you ever once reached out to George Papadopoulos, who was a 8-year-old kid nursing a dream of public service, whose name you exploited as a cheap CNN talking point, and simply said, I'm sorry? 5 seconds. 6. Have you ever once thought about Jennifer? Vance's voice was stripped down to a bare whisper now, forcing the microphone to carry the immense gravity his vocal cords refused to push. Or the dozens of invisible citizens exactly like her, the data entry clerks, the eager volunteers, the low-level staffers who burned their life savings on federal defense attorneys purely because your televised fantasies weaponized their mundane jobs into criminal probes? Have you ever thought about them for a single fraction of a second? 7, 8, 9, 10. Schiff remained paralyzed at the witness desk, both hands plastered flat against the mahogany. The desperate hands of a man who suddenly had nothing to grip, nothing to point with, and nowhere left to run. His posture remained flawlessly rigid. 24 years of congressional hearings had hardwired his spine to remain perfectly erect under extreme duress. But that flawless rigidity was the ultimate tell. When a human being is genuinely at ease, they naturally shift. They adjust. They breathe. Schiff was completely fossilized. He was holding perfectly still, the exact way a trapped animal holds still when any sudden movement triggers the snare. His mouth was sealed shut. Not the tactical, calculating silence of a predator waiting for an opening. It was the suffocated silence of a man ambushed by a question that his 24 years in Washington, his elite Stanford law degree, his stint as a federal prosecutor, and his 423 cable news hits had utterly failed to prepare him for. Directly behind Schiff sat his senior aide, a veteran legislative assistant who had flanked him since his early days in the House, a woman who had watched him effortlessly parry every conceivable political assault. Right now, she was staring obsessively at her own hands, not looking at Schiff, not looking at Vance, just staring blankly at her knuckles. It's the exact coping mechanism you deploy when you cannot look at anything else in the room, because looking up forces you to acknowledge the catastrophic humiliation unfolding right in front of you, and the catastrophe in front of you is your untouchable boss, completely paralyzed by a question a kindergartner could answer. Because the question wasn't legal, it wasn't procedural, it wasn't partisan, it was fundamentally moral. Have you ever apologized? And the truth. The brutal, unspoken truth. The truth that every soul inside that room and every citizen watching at home already knew in their bones was no. He had absolutely never apologized to a single human being for anything across 24 years. Not for the Russia collusion hoax that Mueller completely debunked. Not for the fabricated FISA defense that Inspector General Horne read. Not for the bogus transcript he shamelessly invented and disguised as a parody. Not for Carter Page. Not for Flynn. Not for Papadopoulos. Not for Jennifer. And speaking that word "no" out loud, in a packed Senate hearing room, directly into the face of a vice president who had just meticulously read the roll call of the lives he destroyed, was simply a bridge Adam Schiff's engineered persona could not cross. The flawless instrument that could deflect impeachment battles, survive censures, navigate cable news ambushes, and manipulate hostile committees, completely short-circuited when confronted with the basic human concept of remorse. 11 seconds. 12. Vance gave a single grim nod, the nod of a prosecutor who had extracted his confession through pure silence, because the silence was infinitely louder and infinitely more damning than any syllable Schiff had uttered in 24 years. I didn't think so. Vance's tone was entirely devoid of emotion, not furious, not sorrowful, just flat. The lethal flatness of an absolute truth that requires zero embellishment. Because the elites who broadcast fictions from glamorous television studios never spare a thought for the peasants those fictions crush. You sat comfortably under bright studio lights and assured America that Carter Page was a traitor. You sat in that exact same chair and convinced America that Michael Flynn was a compromised asset. You sat there and entangled George Papadopoulos into a sinister web that existed entirely in your imagination. And then you simply went home. You commuted back to Potomac. You went back to your bloated legal defense fund, your lush Senate campaign, and your lucrative book deals. He picked up the manila folder, razor thin, 5 pages, 5 ruined names. The fables were completely free for you to tell, Senator. They just cost everyone else absolutely everything. He slowly lowered himself into his chair, gripped the gavel, and slammed the hearing into recess. And in the suffocating silence that trailed the crack of that gavel, a heavy silence that lingered agonizingly long because the stunned committee members didn't twitch, the gallery remained frozen, and even the frantic aides stayed rooted to the floor. Adam Schiff remained fossilized at the witness table, his hands plastered flat against the wood, his mouth sealed tight, locked forever in the posture of an arrogant man who had spent 24 years endlessly talking and was finally destroyed by the one question that talking couldn't solve. The viral clip that broke the internet wasn't the one the pundits predicted. It wasn't Carter Page was never charged, although that segment effortlessly pulled 14 million views. It wasn't Flynn sold his house, though that quickly mutated into the most shared video on Facebook across vast veteran networks, playing on an endless loop alongside images of Flynn in full uniform tagged with a single, searing word, betrayed. It wasn't even the 28 years old with a dream, and you turned it into a mugshot moment, even though that specific soundbite echoed across every college campus in America for a solid week, because every ambitious 2-0, something who ever dreamed of shaping public policy, saw their own reflection in George Papadopoulos and felt a cold chill run down their spine. The clip that shattered the algorithm was Jennifer. Her son asked why mommy was crying at the kitchen table. He was 6, 22 devastating words. The entire clip ran exactly 44 seconds. Vance methodically walking through Jennifer's nightmare, from she made $35,000 a year down to you say work stuff, and you wipe your eyes, and you make dinner. 44 seconds. 47 million organic views in roughly 3 days. It was fiercely amplified by enraged parents, by exhausted single mothers, by everyday citizens who had survived the terror of federal subpoenas, by people who had never seen a subpoena but knew exactly what vaporizing $22,000 felt like, by anyone raising a 6-year-old, by anyone who remembered being a terrified 6-year-old watching their parents break down. It went viral because it was undeniably true. Not necessarily factually identical, Jennifer was a composite, a protective shield for the dozens of real victims whose identities Vance refused to expose but emotionally true, viscerally true. The absolute truth of a desperate mother at a kitchen table, the agonizing truth of a child's innocent question, the brutal truth of $22,000, evaporating simply because an untouchable politician in California wanted to spin spy thrillers on television. The Flynn sold his house versus Schiff lied about his house. Juxtaposition instantly became the second most viral phenomenon. A savvy user engineered a brutal split-screen graphic. Flynn's forfeited Virginia home on the left, Schiff's sprawling Potomac estate on the right. The caption was lethal. One patriot sold his home to pay for a crime he didn't commit. The other is facing a federal probe for lying about his. That single image was shared 2.4 million times. Conservative outlets praised it as the ultimate house comparison. Liberal outlets furiously flagged it as misleading because Schiff hadn't been officially indicted yet. Both technical descriptions were accurate. Neither captured why the image was so profoundly devastating, the stark visual of two drastically different houses, side by side. One sacrificed to the machine, one allegedly secured through fraud, both eternally linked by the exact same man's reckless rhetoric. The "have you ever apologized" interrogation spawned the hashtag number "say you're sorry," which utterly dominated trending charts for 48 consecutive hours. Voters flooded social media with ambush videos, demanding to know if their own elected officials had ever genuinely apologized for anything. The vast majority hadn't. The hashtag transcended partisan warfare. It was a raw human reckoning. True accountability doesn't carry a party affiliation. Legal ramifications escalated violently. The dormant mortgage fraud probe was suddenly blasted with blinding national visibility. The sold his house versus lied about his house viral comparison cranked immense political heat onto the U.S. Attorney in Maryland to either forcefully advance the indictment or publicly justify the suspicious delay. Schiff's elite legal defense fund experienced a frantic surge in panic donations, ballooning from $1.2 million to $1.8 million in a matter of 2 weeks. But grassroots opposition fundraising totally eclipsed it, tripling in the same window. The California Republican Party deployed a ruthless mailer to every single registered voter across the state. Adam Schiff hoards $1.8 million for elite lawyers. Carter Page was forced to sell his house. Who was the actual victim? Carter Page, backed by aggressive new counsel, formally announced a massive civil lawsuit probing uncharted claims against Schiff, operating on the legal theory that his endless television appearances conducted far outside the strict boundaries of official legislative duties were absolutely not shielded by absolute congressional immunity. Prominent legal scholars labeled the strategy novel, but decidedly not frivolous. Schiff's panicking spokesperson deflected, branding it just another sad extension of Trump's revenge machine. The lawsuit was officially docketed in the Eastern District of Virginia. That specific docket number organically morphed into a massive bumper sticker. On the Senate floor, 3 hardline Republican senators introduced a historic resolution demanding Schiff's formal censure in the Senate. If successful, it would crown him the first member of Congress in history to be censured by both chambers. The House had already censured him back in June 2023, via a tight 213 to 209 vote, explicitly for intentionally misleading the American public. This new Senate resolution aggressively cited a documented pattern of reckless public broadcasts that inflicted catastrophic, demonstrable damage on private citizens who were never even charged with crimes. It quickly gathered 31 co-sponsors. It technically required 67 votes to pass. It ultimately failed, but that number 31 became a heavy shadow that stalked Schiff into every single room for the remainder of the session. 31 sitting senators who had reviewed the ruined names, analyzed the raw evidence, and boldly inked their signatures onto a document declaring your televised fictions caused real-world bloodshed and those casualties demand a public reckoning. Schiff's press shop released a sterile, desperate statement. This is a baseless continuation of the politically motivated attacks against Senator Schiff by a corrupt administration that seeks to ruthlessly silence its critics. The statement deployed the word silence exactly 3 times. It completely failed to mention Carter Page, Michael Flynn, George Papadopoulos, or the word apologize. The glaring silence in that written statement was infinitely louder than the humiliated silence in the hearing room. Dorothy Chen sat quietly at her cramped desk on the 3rd floor of the Hart Senate Office building, the exact same building where she had watched Tulsi Gabbard surgically dissect Adam Schiff's files just 4 months prior. Same cluttered desk. Same faded coffee mug, the cheap one with the chipped handle she kept, solely because her proud mother gifted it to her on her very first day in Washington. Same depressing view of the marble hallway where powerful senators continuously marched past, completely oblivious to the 7-year-old staffer who tirelessly drafted their memos. She had watched Tulsi's hearing covertly on her iPhone, squeezing it between assignments in stolen, anxious minutes. She had watched Tulsi crack open the colored folders, read the classified intercept data, and prove methodically, surgically, ruthlessly that Schiff had lied. Now, she was watching Vance's hearing, on a completely different screen, the massive office television this time, purely because her boss was glued to it too. And in D.C., when the boss watches, the entire staff watches. It carried a vastly different weight. Tulsi had exposed the hard evidence, the folders, the classified files, the digital metadata. Tulsi had successfully proven that Schiff lied. That was critical. That was necessary. That was the foundational bedrock. But Vance exposed the human wreckage, not dry documents, not redacted files, flesh and blood names. Carter Page, permanently blacklisted from employment. Michael Flynn, stripped of his home. George Papadopoulos, thrown in a cage at 28. Jennifer, drained of $22,000 while comforting a crying 6-year-old. Dorothy slowly lowered her coffee mug. The classified folders proved he lied. The human names proved it actually mattered. She anxiously considered her own meager salary, $52,000. Honestly, barely a step above Jennifer S. She visualized the sheer horror of a federal subpoena landing on her small desk. Not for a malicious crime she damn orchestrated, but for some mundane document she had blindly processed. She thought heavily about $22,000. She mentally checked her bank app to see if she even possessed $22,000. She absolutely did not. Dorothy picked her coffee back up, took a slow, nervous sip, and stared at the television screen where Schiff was still frozen in utter silence, palms glued to the table, jaw clamped shut. "That's exactly what it looks like," she whispered to the empty room. When the manipulative words finally run out, Marcus Webb sat slumped in his battered truck in the sprawling parking lot of a Lowe's on East Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio. 6:23 p.m. The absolute end of a grueling shift. His calloused hands were still caked in white drywall dust. The stubborn, abrasive dust that burrows deep into the creases of your knuckles and refuses to leave until the second scalding shower, because every tradesman knows the first shower only strips the surface, and electricians know the surface is never the actual job. His cracked phone was propped up against the steering wheel. The Vance clip was rolling. The specific segment about Jennifer. Marcus was 44 years old. He had been a proud electrician since he was barely 20, knocked out his apprenticeship at 18, hit journeyman status at 22, and secured his master license at 28. He had never worked a single day in politics. He had absolutely no desire to. But back in 2016, he had enthusiastically volunteered for the Trump campaign for exactly 2 weekends, late October, the final, desperate push before Election Day. He hammered some yard signs into lawns, knocked on a few local doors, nothing high-level, nothing covert. He simply believed in a cause and showed up to sweat for it. That was the entire extent of it. In 2018, he received a thick envelope in the mail, not a formal subpoena, but a highly aggressive letter from a white shoe D.C. law firm representing the omnipotent House Intelligence Committee. The letter menacingly demanded any and all communications remotely connected to his volunteer activities on behalf of the 2016 presidential campaign. Marcus didn't grasp the legal distinction between a threatening letter and a binding subpoena. He was a master electrician. He intuitively understood the lethal difference between 120 and 240 volts. He knew exactly when to run Romex versus rigid conduit. He possessed zero understanding of the murky divide between a voluntary congressional inquiry and a federal legal mandate. So he immediately hired a lawyer, because that is exactly what working-class men do when a terrifying letter from Congress lands in their mailbox and they don't understand the jargon. You hire an expert who does. The lawyer was based in Columbus, not D.C. Marcus couldn't even fathom D.C. billing rates. The Columbus guy charged $200 an hour. The lawyer quickly skimmed the letter, made 2 brief phone calls, drafted a generic 1-page response, and slammed Marcus with a $3,200 invoice. $3,200. That was Marcus's entire, hard-fought emergency fund. He had painstakingly built that safety net over 6 long years, exactly $50 at a time. Every single paycheck, a rigid $50, was routed into a separate savings account that Marcus treated like absolute holy ground. He never touched it. Not for cheap vacations, not for shiny new power tools, not for anything except the catastrophic emergencies that every blue-collar worker knows are constantly lurking in the shadows. The work truck suddenly blowing a transmission. The brutally slow winter months when absolutely nobody is pouring foundation. The sudden job site injury that grounds you for 6 agonizing weeks, while the meager disability check doesn't arrive until 4 weeks after the landlord demands rent, $3,200. 6 years of relentless discipline, vaporized for a 1-page letter that simply stated, "Mr. Webb possesses no communications responsive to your broad request," and it was never followed up on, not once. Nobody ever called. Nobody ever replied. Nobody from the massive House Intelligence Committee, or the sprawling special counsel's office, or any other federal alphabet agency ever contacted Marcus Webb again. He just hammered some signs into the dirt. He just knocked on some doors. And it unfairly cost him $3,200 to legally confirm that exercising his First Amendment rights wasn't a federal crime. Marcus silently watched the Vance clip, absorbed the tragic details of Jennifer's nightmare, the $22,000, the weeping at the kitchen table, the terrified 6-year-old. Marcus didn't have a 6-year-old kid. He had a fiercely loyal yellow lab named Biscuit, who always rode shotgun in the work truck and lacked the capacity to understand corrupt politics, but possessed an uncanny ability to sense when Marcus was quiet for way too long, meaning something was deeply wrong. "I just put up some damn yard signs," Marcus muttered quietly to Biscuit. "Yard signs on my weekends off, and it cost me $3,200 to find out that wasn't illegal." Biscuit stared back at him. Biscuit couldn't comprehend the value of $3,200. Biscuit only knew that Marcus' tone was hollow, his calloused hands were frozen on the wheel, the truck engine was dead, and that meant they weren't heading home for dinner yet. 6 grueling years of squirreling away $50 a paycheck. Marcus stared down at his battered hands. The white drywall dust caked in the deep creases. The scarred hands of a man who built things with his hands, saved his money with his hands, and had his entire safety net stolen, simply because an arrogant congressman in California decided to spin fictional spy thrillers on television about a grassroots campaign that Marcus had sweat for over 2 October weekends. He finally cranked the ignition, threw the truck in drive. Biscuit happily rode shotgun, pressing his wet nose against the glass, watching the Columbus streets roll by, the amber streetlights flickering to life, the massive low S sign receding in the rearview mirror, the colorful political yard signs staked into suburban lawns promoting new candidates that Marcus would absolutely never volunteer for again. Not because his core beliefs had wavered, but because participating in the process had cost him $3,200, and 6 years of his life. Marcus had rigorously launched a new emergency fund the exact month after that parasitic lawyer's bill cleared. Same local bank, Huntington on East Main, same exact account tier. A pathetic 0.03% interest yield. No minimum balance required. The exact financial product megabanks offer to working-class people who don't possess enough wealth to qualify for basic respect. The exact same $50 a paycheck. He was 3 years deep into the rebuild now, sitting at $3,900, technically more cash than the first time. But this new fund felt fundamentally different. The original fund was constructed on a foundation of trust that financial discipline was rewarded, trust that catastrophic emergencies were statistically rare, trust that the massive federal machine wouldn't arbitrarily reach into a working man's life and ruin him for the non-crime of hammering yard signs into the dirt on 2 October weekends. The new fund was constructed on pure, paranoid awareness, the dark realization that a menacing letter from Washington could blindside any address at any random hour, for any arbitrary reason, or for absolutely no reason whatsoever. And the singular, pathetic shield against that machine was saving $50 a paycheck. Every single paycheck, for the rest of his life. Biscuit smeared his nose against the passenger window. Marcus just kept driving, the abrasive drywall dust settling deeper into his scarred knuckles. Schiff branded it a petty revenge tour. Vance executed it as a solemn roll call. Carter Page, Naval Academy alumni. Never charged. Permanently unemployable. Michael Flynn. 3 stars. 33 years of blood and sweat. Forced to sell his family home. George Papadopoulos, 28 years old. Tossed in a federal cage for 12 days. A pure dream mutated into a bleak mugshot. Jennifer, grinding out $35,000 a year. Extorted for $22,000 in legal fees. A terrified 6-year-old begging to know why mommy was crying. And Adam Schiff. A sprawling estate under active federal investigation, $2,700 pocketed from a convicted felon. A forged transcript he arrogantly dismissed as a parody. A bloated $1.2 million legal slush fund. And not one single syllable of an apology. God bless Dorothy Chen, the invisible staffer who understood that the classified folders proved he lied, but the shattered names proved it actually mattered. God bless Marcus Webb, the electrician who staked yard signs for 2 October weekends and sacrificed 6 years of $50 paychecks just to learn that engaging in American democracy carries a lethal price tag when an untouchable elite on television decides your candidate is a Russian conspiracy. And God bless Biscuit, the loyal dog who doesn't understand Washington politics but instinctively knows when a good man goes quiet for far too long. 423 primetime television appearances. 0 criminal charges against the innocent people he publicly smeared. $22,000 eradicated from a woman surviving on $35,000. $3,200 extorted from a tradesman who painstakingly saved it $50 at a time. A family sanctuary liquidated by a combat general. A brilliant career annihilated for a Naval Academy grad. A 8-year-old's bright future swapped for a booking photo. And one final question. One agonizingly simple, human question that the most articulate, silver-tongued man in the United States Senate could not possibly answer in 12 suffocating seconds of dead silence. Have you ever said you were sorry?